So which are the strongest tanks and infantry that the Guard can bring to bear? Let's go through all of them in a Codex Astra Militarum tier ranking. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the strongest units for the Guard. It's been about a year since I did my last one of these, and honestly quite a lot has changed. We've got a whole new edition, multiple waves of points cost changes, and I thought it would be nice to reassess where the Guard are right now. In this video we're going to focus on all of the Guard damage dealing units. I'm going to leave out any HQs and characters. I feel like the leaders of the army are really quite a different debate. So in this video we're going to be going through any of the battle line units, ones that can both take and receive damage. Obviously with these tier rankings it's going to be largely based on my own opinion as a Guard player. I'll go through each unit and why I've ranked it where I have, but please let me know if you disagree with anything, if I've ranked anything too high or too low. In any case, let's jump straight into it and start with the lowest tier, which I've ranked in tier 4. So in the lowest tier for the Guard we have the Baneblade chassis tanks, heavy weapon squads, Woodvane Psykers, Servitors, Ogrins and the Deathstrike missile. Starting out with the poor Deathstrike, it just remains badly hampered by having to wait several turns to fire off its missile, and even then, unless you're against the right opponent with a bunch of clustered units that want to take mortal wounds, you still might not necessarily get the biggest bang for your buck. Either this thing needs to be very very cheap, or a rules rewrite to allow you to launch the missile a bit early for it really to be considering worth taking. Next we have the Ogrins. Games Workshop really hasn't been kind to these big boys. Throughout most of 8th edition they were considered inferior to Bullgrins, and then for some reason Games Workshop has further increased their points and dropped the points on Bullgrins at the same time. At 30 points a model they just really don't justify the cost of half an infantry squad. They're just not tough, shooty or fighty enough to justify that points cost. Next up we come to Servitors. They now cost 30 points for a unit, and might be able to have some niche use if you pack them out with a couple of multi-melters, which if you did happen to have a tech priest nearby, could actually give you some reasonable firepower. I just feel that these guys are just too fragile, too points intensive, and not mobile enough to make them worth it. I think to run them optimally, you need 3 squads clustered around a tech priest, giving them ballistic skill 4+, and even then that's quite a lot of points for some fairly fragile bodies that aren't going to want to move. Next we have the Woodvane Psykers. Again, horribly hampered by poor rules ever since they came out, mainly that they're just not very reliable at casting spells with a low chance to get the Guard powers off. Generally they've just never been worth taking versus Astropaths and Primaris Psykers, who have the big advantage of not being able to be shot directly by the enemy, and I would say that the only reason that you want to bring these is to use the Primaris Psyker stratagem to be able to cast a bit more reliably. Even then though, I'm just not really sure that that's the best use of points and command points. I think I'd rather just go with Astropaths for casting Guard powers. Next we come to the heavy weapon teams, who have descended quite a long way from their heyday at the start of 8th edition. These guys will put out reasonable firepower point for point, but the problem is that they're just so fragile to taking return fire themselves. Your opponent can efficiently fire just about any weapon at them, they'll die and take a whole lot of points with them, and for me the damage output just isn't spectacular enough to warrant the investment in them. Perhaps could be good for a bit of niche use, ideally sitting out of line of sight on objectives if that's possible, raining down some mortar shots. But in general, I think that there are better ways to put out firepower with the Guard right now. Finally, and quite sadly, we have the Baneblade chassis tanks, which I'm just including under the one category. The issue with these at the moment is that they're less efficient than tank commanders, they're both less tough and have less damage output, and the rules for the super heavy detachments are really quite problematic in 9th, meaning that if you want one you're going to have to pay 3 command points for it, and if you go a bit mad and want 3 of these, it's going to cost you a ton of points as well as 6 CP. They either need a decent points drop or a tweak to the super heavy detachment rules if they want to see more play. The Shadow Sword's always quite interesting, as it will pretty much auto-delete one foe. If super heavies make a bit more of a comeback in the meta, it might well be worth it a bit more, but seeing as they're quite rarely played, I think that we can get by with Demolisher Cannons at the moment. Moving up a bit to Tier 3, these are some of the units that I think have a bit more use, but are still really quite niche selections. Here we have Conscripts, Taurox and the Taurox Prime, Ratlings, Crusaders and Hydras. Starting out with the Hydra, its only real advantages are that it's cheap and it puts out some steady firepower, though it's only really all that much used against targets that have the fly keyword. I think it's going to hurt your army less than some of the other units in Tier 4, at least it will put out some reliable damage each turn, but it's really just not enough compared with the other choices. It's annoying that it's not even particularly efficient against aircraft due to its low AP and relatively low damage. Next up we have the Guard Crusader squad. I can't say they've been the biggest fan of the Storm Shield change, going from a 3+ invul down to a 4+, but they can be kind of interesting as 2-wound infantry units who could potentially come into strategic reserve and maybe score some points for deploying scramblers or securing table quarters. The thing is, that's not the hardest thing for Guard to achieve. We've got quite a lot of chaff infantry units already, and I'm just not convinced that the damage output and durability per point of these guys is really worth it. Next up we come to the Ratlings, who I've chosen to rank here more because of their slightly forward deployment options more than anything else, and their jumpy movement shenanigans with Shoot Sharp and Scarper. I'm afraid for all the points I'm just really not massively convinced about their sniper damage output, and they're really easy to kill if the opponent can get line of sight on them. I think they're actually more kind of useful as a guard screening unit, albeit a bit of a premium one. They can plink a few mortal wounds onto characters perhaps, and potentially get you some bodies on objectives a bit quicker than your standard guardsman. Next we have the Taurox and Taurox Prime, both of which are kind of overshadowed by other guard options in my opinion. The Taurox mainly just loses the Battle of the Transports to the Chimera. Chimeras are really cheap, they're tougher, and arguably even have better firepower with their lasgun arrays. The Taurox Prime is kind of midway between a transport and a gun platform. If you are trying to play pure Militarum Tempestus, they'll have a bit more value as you're locked out of other choices, but in general for Scions I'd rather deep strike them, and save ground-based guard firepower for more efficient units. Next up we come to the Conscript Squad. They're now very slightly cheaper than infantry units, still have very limited damage output, but I do find the conscripts quite interesting for guard, seeing as they're just about the toughest bodies that we can push on objectives. I think most of the time most commanders are still going to want to choose infantry squads over them. They can actually deal damage a bit and take things like special weapons, but if you literally need nothing else but bodies on objectives to hold the line, the conscript squads can do very well. I think the main incentive to take them is that they can make really efficient use of certain defensive buffs. Things like astropaths with psychic barrier, plus the take cover stratagem, means that you could potentially have 30 conscripts with a 3+ armor save even in the open, and that's not going to be easy for your opponent to shift off an objective efficiently. So moving on to tier 2 now, and we're starting to get into some of the guard units that can really pack a punch. Here I've chosen to rank Leman Russes and Knight Commander Pask, Scout and Armoured Sentinels, Basilisks, Hellhounds, Tempestus Scions and Scion Command Squads, Valkyries, Veterans, Special Weapons Squads and Command Squads, and Wyverns. Out of this list, perhaps the one that I was most considering ranking in tier 3 was the Wyvern. They have gone up in points fairly significantly since 8th, and with Vigilus detachments being removed from more competitive games, that has cut its firepower down quite significantly. I'd say the Wyvern is only really there if you need to add some more anti-horde to a guard list. It's just really not going to be very competitive against Space Marines, but against anything with 11 models or more in the unit, you're going to be getting a full 24 anti-infantry shots out of it. Really quite nice with ignores line of sight, and in some games still be an absolute star. Just maybe not quite as much of a take-all-comers option for me. Next I've chosen to talk about the Veterans, Special Weapons Squads and Command Squads together. For me, I would generally see these as the different ways to bring guard special weapons to bear and actually use your infantry as damage dealers. Command Squads will give you the highest accurate rate of firepower out of the 3, though of course they have almost no durability with only 4 bodies. Special Weapons Squads are a bit of a halfway house, and Veteran Squads will keep your special weapons insulated by a decent number of lasguns. They can all be pretty efficient when jumping out of chimeras or out of strategic reserve, particularly if they're being able to get plasma or melter in on hard targets like marines. In particular, I've had fun outflanking a bunch of special weapon and command squads with plasma. You can put them in strategic reserve for really quite cheap in terms of points cost, and then fry a surprising amount of space marines on the turn that they come in. The main weakness is that they're all really quite fragile to return firepower. It's not going to take many bolter shots to make them go away, so if they don't do absolutely devastating damage on the alpha strike, then you're in for a bad time. Next up we have the Guard Valkyrie, essentially the premium transport choice for Guard and Tempestus Scions. It is a bit of a luxury at 120 points, but it will pretty near guaranteed get your squad where they need to go, as well as being pretty tough point for point. It can pair well with delivering any of those damage dealers, has some additional synergies with Tempestus Scions, and you could even potentially have things like Bullgrin jump out of it if you want to. For me, I'd say the main limitation of the Valkyrie is that it can't contest objectives like Chimeras can, and perhaps if the infantry getting out of it were a bit more devastating, it'd see a bit more competitive play. Personally, I wouldn't go mad on them and spam loads, but just having one with some special weapon threats can actually be surprisingly useful. It can make your opponent really think about positioning if you have the ability to put a scary unit all the way behind their lines. Next up, I've chosen to rank Tempestus Scions and Scion Command Squads here. They are perhaps a unit that I'd consider putting in tier 1 in the right circumstances. Personally, I think perhaps the most competitive use of Scions is just to have a few small cheap squads to drop in annoying places in the enemy line and maybe make nuisance charges or steal objectives. The alternative is to try and use them as damage dealers in their own right. They do have some really quite useful synergies with their Scion regiments, and their order for re-rolling and wound rolls can be really nice with plasma guns in their command squads. But again, I do feel that they suffer from the same issues as veterans and special weapon squads, basically jumping in, getting one decent strike of damage, and then dying straight back in return. I prefer to use them a bit more of a utility tool than as a hammer blow, though they can be very scary in the right situation if your opponent doesn't have enough screens. Next up we come to the Hellhound, and out of the three variants I'm far more of a fan of the actual Hellhound compared with the Devil Dog or Bane Wolf. I think that Hellhounds make fairly decent battle line units, particularly combined with the Kaschan Regimental Doctrine or custom ones such as Gunnery Experts, to allow you to re-roll the number of shots on those flamer weapons. I think that Hellhounds are fairly solid and reliable units that will pretty much guarantee you some damage on the target each turn, but unless they can catch some light infantry out in the open, they're not going to absolutely devastate enemy formations. Against anything with any armour, they're just going to chip a couple of wounds each turn, while at least being reasonably durable. I do think it can be quite interesting to run them as sort of mixed role units now, mounting a multi-melter rather than a heavy flamer, which can give them a bit of bite against both infantry and vehicles. The dependable Basilisk is next, lobbing away shells at 240 inches for a very long time in the Guard, and still being a fairly efficient choice for Ignore's line of sight shooting. I think in general you don't want to go absolutely mad with artillery in the Guard, but just having a few of them to chip off the last wounds of units hiding out of line of sight can be really handy, and they combine quite well with Gunnery Experts, Katachans or Cadians. I'd say the main issue that the Basilisk has is that it isn't a Manticore. If the Manticore didn't exist, I'm sure we'd be using these guys with full payload tank ace trait, but unfortunately for the Basilisk, the Manticore is a very similar battlefield role and does kind of steal its thunder right now. 20 more points is a pretty reasonable upgrade to get up to strength 10, and an average of 7 shots coming out of it each turn, rather than 4.5. Next up we come to Sentinels. Both the Scout version and Armoured Sentinel are really quite usable. They're quite tough, but unfortunately just really have quite underwhelming damage output, despite the repeated points drops that they've been getting since the Guard Codex came out in 8th. Scout Sentinels with multi-lasers or heavy flamers can be an interesting screening choice with their pre-game move and decent movement. Armoured Sentinels are just genuinely really quite tough for the points, and can potentially deliver a fairly decent alpha strike with hunter-killer missiles and las cannons backed up with their stratagem to add one to hit and wound. Even with that and all the hunter-killer missiles though, the damage output doesn't really stack up very well versus other things like Lehman Russ tanks, and you might not be able to draw a bead on your ideal target on turn 1. I actually just think that the multi-laser armed sentinel could be the most interesting, except that it's not going to do tons of damage and just have a really durable unit to annoy and harass the enemy and screen them out from your battle line. Heavy flamers could be an option if you want to deal a little bit more damage on top of that. Finally for tier 2, we have the Lehman Russ battle tanks and Knight Commander Pask. The standard Lehman Russ has certainly seen its ups and downs over 8th and 9th edition, and at the moment I'd typically be looking to go with Demolisher Cannons being some of the most efficient Guard firepower even when not on tank commanders. The standard Lehman Russ caught up a little bit of ground on tank commanders in the latest FAQ. They dropped 5 points with tank commanders going up a bit, so the gap is a little bit closer than it was before. I would still say though that the sheer damage output you get from tank commanders likely makes them the first choice over Lehman Russes, though per point of course the standard Russ will be a bit more durable. Pask I feel kind of goes the other way. You have that excellent ballistic skill too, but of course you'll be paying a massive premium for him to get it, and your opponent will know that he's an absolute number 1 target priority, not really being all that hard to take down for the number of points that you have invested in him. I'd say it has a little bit less synergy with some of the best options in Demolisher Cannons and Punisher Cannons, as he's not able to get the plus 6 inches range from things like Vostroyan or the Spotter Detail's custom regiment trait. He's certainly by no means bad, and is the most efficient choice of anti-tank firepower in the entire codex, but he is just a bit fragile for the number of points that you have invested. So finally we get to the best units in the Guard, ones that I think are going to be making appearances in virtually every competitive Guard list. Building something around a hefty contingent of this lot, with a few more niche choices thrown in, seems like a good way to go at the moment. Here we have the Tank Commander, the Infantry Squad, Chimeras, Manticores, and Borgren. Borgren have remained a solid battle line unit for the Guard throughout 8th edition, and for some reason in the last points changes, they had yet another massive points drop on top of that. A Borgren with a Slab Shield and Borgren Maul will now only cost you 35 points. Not bad for a meaty toughness 5 unit with a 2+ save that can easily be improved beyond that with various buffs. You can either run them in a big Borgren Death Star, with say 8 or 9 Borgrin in a unit, and then augment them with Psychic Barrier for +1 to their saves, and maybe think about using Take Cover. Or now with them being as cheap as they are, you could even think about running multiple squads, maybe even in Chimeras. They're a very decent bully unit for making enemy units keep away with them, unless they want to be flattened by a boatload of Strength 7 autocannon hits in combat. Melee is really important in 9th edition, and Borgrin are pretty much the most efficient guard melee unit that we have going right now. Next up we have the Premier Guard Artillery choice in the Manticore. One of these with the full payload tank ace trait can get you flat damage 3 shots, and when you're putting out an average of 7 or 8 of them each turn, you're going to be stacking a lot of saves on things like pesky Space Marines in Gravis armor, or even just hurting some hard targets. It's really hard to go too far wrong with these. They're some of the best artillery in the game right now. Being able to put the hurt on enemy units hiding out of line of sight is very nice indeed. As an aside, you can also equip one with a Hunter Killer missile, which will also get flat damage 6 if you do manage to get the shot through. Next up we have the trusty Chimera transport, which with its crazily low points cost is now one of the best transports in 40k. With a multi-laser it's only 75 points, cheaper than a Space Marine Rhino, so technically tougher than that, while also packing a couple of heavy weapons and even allowing the infantry to fire inside it with those lasgun arrays. It certainly is a transport, not a damage dealer, but having a few of these in the guard army will make the force considerably tougher. Getting toughness 7 vehicle wounds on the table for less than 8 points per wound is really nice, and of course you can use it as a mobile bunker for your Auspex infantry squads to jump out of, or your special weapons squads to get out of and deal some damage. Despite the recent points increase for the infantry squad to 55 points, I still think they remain top tier for the guard. They may have a few offensive damage tricks, such as first rank fire, second rank fire, and being able to throw in cheap special weapons such as melter guns and plasma, but honestly I'd focus a lot more on what they can do in terms of movement and securing objectives, as opposed to actually trying to kill the opponents. Even despite going up a few points, compared with virtually any other faction's chaff infantry, things that are 5 or 6 points, they do compare really nicely indeed. A 5+ armor save with their flak armor isn't too bad, and some reasonable anti-infantry firepower with the lasguns. Generally though, I think their biggest power is just securing objectives with OBSEC, and particularly making great use of move, which can catapult them straight across the table turn 1. It can really scupper your opponent's battle plans if some of their big heavy hitters are tied up because they can't walk past a cheap screen of infantry that you've put in their way. Generally, I think most guard forces are still going to include a decent contingent of these. They're pretty durable, pretty mobile, and have the all-important objective secured. Just don't expect them to do wonders in terms of damage output. Finally, last but not least, we come to the mighty Tank Commander, who despite being slapped with a 5-point increase, still remains what I'd call the best damage dealer in the Guard Codex. 200 points if you buy him a las cannon, and you've got a unit that's throwing out 8 great quality anti-tank shots every turn. Perhaps more if he's Kaschan, Cadian or Gunnery experts. You can pay for a stratagem to have him fire a maximum of 12 shots from his Demolisher Cannon against enemy tanks. You can allow him to reroll 1s or to pop smoke launchers in the same time that you shoot, making him either more deadly or more durable. And even if he does just go with his base number of shots and reroll 1s, he'll be averaging you a whopping 12 wounds on any enemy tanks that are toughness 7 or 8. Again, while not quite as pricey as Pask, they are still fairly expensive to field, and if they're gunned down before they get to fire, you're certainly going to feel the blow, but just for that amount of damage output, the rewards potentially outweigh the risks. So as always, let me know what you think on the tier rankings. Have I ranked anything too high or too low? Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments. There's certainly no doubt that quite a lot of things are looking for a bit of an update out of a new codex. I kind of feel that a lot of guard units just aren't particularly well balanced at the moment. The top tier units just invalidating quite a lot of the rest in the codex, at least for more competitive optimized lists. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be doing a few more of these tier ranking videos, and plenty more videos for the guard, so subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see more. Finally, if you have been enjoying these videos and would like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page which you can find down in the video description. Making all this content does take a fair amount of time, so if you are enjoying regularly, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.